Greetings to everybody. This is our fourth and last talk. Most of you have figured out by now that I'm able to go on and on and on, but that's not the point of this seminar. Nevertheless, the fourth talk I think is important so that I can pull together a lot of loose ends. Now, the point I've tried to make up until now is that there are a lot of interrelated things that one has to be concerned about, not just in terms of talking about genocide and impunity, but everything. And I also pointed out that people should be prepared to get an answer for themselves in terms of why anyone should care about anyone's genocide. I'm not Armenian, why should I worry about a genocide? And we've heard the expression, crimes against humanity. Well, maybe you don't know what a crime against humanity is. Hopefully one of the things that will come out of this course, not just these 4 lectures that you've been subjected to, is that you will be able to, again, on your own steam, come to a conclusion that will be useful. Education, as I mentioned, is not just a matter of what do I need to know for the test. That's not what it's about. The whole point is when you're over, as I've been told, is when you're an educated person, you should know what you don't know. Now that maybe sounds like an oxymoron, but I think you get the point. The business of interrelatedness in terms of topics is nothing that should be taken too casually. It's the very basis of education. Now here you are in a university, and I'm going to actually take a minute to define what I think a university is. You probably think you know what it is, but let me just tell you that traditionally, and over the centuries, a university has been regarded as a place where knowledge and information is maintained and collected and preserved. Then there's this idea of producing new information. Now, those of us in science did it largely through theoretical, or in my case, and in Dr. Schmidt's case, through experimentation, laboratory investigation. So you create new knowledge, and then you interpret that in terms of the old information which you've preserved and interpreted, and see what is good, bad, or indifferent, fits in or doesn't fit in, and then you go to the next step. But in the course of all of this, there's one ultimate goal, and that is to pass this on to young generations, such as your own, so that we do what's called education. Now, that doesn't mean we should feed you pablum. I told you the first lecture that my own roots are such that perhaps I don't even give you an unbiased perspective. I think I do, but there are plenty who would say, no way, it can't be fair and balanced. Well, I said my own opinion on fair and balanced is a joke. No one is fair and balanced. Even library catalogers, whether they're working in archives that I mentioned, or if they're running big universities or the Library of Congress, even subject headings, which some might say are very arbitrary, that puts a label on something and you've already expressed a bias or a prejudice. So when I throw a few stones at historians, I don't really mean to throw stones, I just merely mean to say that, for instance, we'll get into it in a moment, some say that let the historians decide whether this, that, or the other was a genocide. And I think I made the smart aleck comment that the historians don't even agree on the color red. The last thing to do is put anything in the hands of the historians, in my opinion, is that it'll drag it on and on and on and never get resolved. And I also mentioned Raphael Lemkin, who would be turning in his grave. I said you could go over to Mount Hebron Cemetery in Flushing and see for yourself if he's turned over or not, that what he intended in the first genocide convention was substantially watered down. And part of that was rationalized on the basis that, oh, well, we've got to compromise. He just said that because he had to, I think. Now here's a French titled work, Raphael Lemkin, Qu'est-ce que c'est qu'un génocide? What's a genocide? Good question. It's not what he thought it was, it's what it's come to be, apparently. And I say apparently because the jurists and the lawyers have made very heavy water of all of this. Here's a volume, The Criminal Law of Genocide, International, Comparative, and Contextual Aspects. Now, the idea here is that we've got to take a genocide in its context. And I say, oh, do we? Why? They haven't given me a good reason why. It's because they want to keep the system going for whatever reason, in my opinion again, and I'll tell you a little bit more about in my opinion. Norman Finkelstein, who I referred to not by name, but I mentioned as a great scholar who was joking about the Occupy movement at Zucchini Park, because he couldn't remember Zuccotti Park, not that most New Yorkers could remember Zuccotti Park. But Norman Finkelstein wrote this book. He's written quite a few. His parents were survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. And he's saying they're making a business out of this. And there's a terrific interview of him, very informal, but nevertheless fantastically excellent in my opinion, where he's being very candid about all of this. He was essentially not given tenure at a Catholic university in Chicago, mainly because of some fairly strong people in the academic environment didn't see fit that he should be out telling his opinion inside of it all. So in any case, he's ended up landing on his 2 feet. He's done well for himself. And of course, there is the old idea that the truth will, in fact, ultimately prevail. The truth will make us all free. Now, I have been in this series of 4 lectures, here and there and everywhere. Now, that's been deliberate in the sense that I didn't write a script. If I had to give these lectures over again, I probably couldn't give it the same way. I know I wouldn't give it the same way. We don't have a teleprompter. This is what an old-fashioned teleprompter sheet looked like. Happens to be it's the last talk that President Dwight David Eisenhower gave when Ike gave his famous speech on the industrial complex that was pushing arms sales. And he warned people that the military-industrial complex was going to get too strong. Now, a friend said years ago, it's a little bit like our country being in the arms industry. In fact, it's a very big business. He said, we supply everybody with arms, and then we say, fight nice. Now, you kind of chuckle at that. Fight nice. You arm people to the teeth, and then you say, fight nice. Well, what do you expect under those circumstances? Now, I have a brother-in-law, one of my 2 brothers-in-law, who said, look, my mother didn't need a PhD to know that what her family experienced and her relatives and herself went through during what has come to be called the Armenian Genocide. Now, again, I think that's very telling, but the thing that's significant here is that many have felt that the victims or perceived victims don't have a voice in the historical context. That's because they're biased, they've gotten old, they can't remember, they've got their facts a little bit mucked up, etc. Well, that's true, but it ought to be part of the equation. And only now, is a lot of this material going to be curated and looked after properly? There are a number of interviews that have been done over the years, a lot of them at UCLA Library, which is quite substantial, Columbia University, and even Yale University under the Steven Spielberg, the filmmaker, has got some Nazi Holocaust archival documentation from victim survivors. And they're going to add to that, apparently, some of the Armenian materials and other genocides as well. So the word is that the more that gets out, the more well-known this will all be. Now, you say, why bother? Well, I hope you don't really ask that at this point in time, because we've been telling you that whatever happens to one group can happen to anyone, and we should all realize that there's common humanity that we've got to be concerned with. You remember that German documentation that I told you on the an information project on the Near and Middle East that was put out in German, the INAMO? I don't think you need to worry too much about this, but if you look at this, the panels start off on the far left with a very clear-cut image. And as you go across from left to right, the image ends up becoming increasingly pixelated. That's telling you that these things get forgotten. And when we close up today, we'll use the old famous Hitler quote, "Who today remembers what happened to the Armenians?" So part of this whole business is indeed a small part of getting some documents down so that the memory will be preserved. Now, in my own family, I'm the youngest, and we were in contact with people, mostly deceased. My godmother was the youngest in the village that got sort of persecuted by the Turks. She died a few years ago at the age of 106. All the others are gone. So I'm one of the few dinosaurs, even at my young age, that can recall stories from people who went through all of this. And before long, that'll all be gone too. And one of the difficulties with history is that people read, they hear what they want to hear, they hear what they think they've heard, they write it down, perhaps, they talk about it, and then the question is, how precise or accurate is all of this? Now, I have a funny cartoon here, funny to me, I like it very much. It's a New Yorker, September 3rd, 2012, from a very excellent cartoonist, Wyatt. It says, "I regret that my poor choice of words caused some people to understand what I was saying." Now, it's really very typical. I mean, when you listen to some of the congressmen and the senators, they can't come out with a simple declarative statement. I'm not sure they can't, but they won't. Because then you might end up understanding what they really mean, and then they apologize. "I didn't mean that, I didn't mean this." So one would like to be very precise. And it's not that easy to be precise, because the theme that I'm going to harp on today is this business of impunity. How much do you believe? How much do you think is arguable? Americans traditionally, supposedly, like to hear a balanced approach. There's two sides to every story. Well, maybe. Now, some of you have heard about the legislation in France that was going to make it a crime to deny the Armenian Genocide. And many, and me included, didn't like the idea of trying to say that it's illegal to speak your mind, whether you like what you've heard or not. But yet I'll also point out that in France, it's illegal to deny the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews. So now you can say, look, well, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And if you're not going to allow it for the Armenians, you better not allow it or disallow it for the Nazi genocide victims, predominantly the Jews. So here you have it. So that's one of the difficulties in all of this. Now, the approach that's being used on occasion is that the business of wanting to put forward what some have called a mythology. Here's an excellent book called Myths and Memories of the Nation. We all have our ideas of what we're all about. The United States is not an exception. Or I should say quickly, some are saying that the Americans are saying that there is an American exceptionalism. We're better than everybody else. We're not like them. So we other people, as they say. And in the process, we end up believing our own myths. Now, Turkey has a myth, too. The myth is that they're wonderful, they're terrific, and they didn't commit any genocide. Now, if you go to Turkey, as I have, you say, what a nice place, nice people, pleasant. You don't want to get into the device of stereotyping people and making them into terrible, evil people. That doesn't solve anything. It's inaccurate. At the same time, one has to recognize that we all have a history, and some of it is not very pleasant, and it does very little good to sort of try to suppress it or rewrite it. Now, the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, not too many people have gone overboard admitting that there were other victims. I know a woman whose relatives were Catholic Poles who were victims of the Nazi Holocaust in Poland. Not just Nazi Jews or Jews all over the areas taken over by the Third Reich. Very few books. A mosaic of victims. Non-Jews persecuted and murdered by the Nazis. Now I'm going to use the excuse to mention this word persecuted. There is a movement in some places, I've noticed it more in Germany than amongst others, where the word persecution is being used. Some people think, perhaps, in my opinion, that it's a softer way of looking at it. Remember I said the G word is something that one abhors. You don't want to say that you're involved in the genocide of anybody. In Turkey, there's been a very careful movement to rewrite history. And that's going to turn out to be, as we'll see, fairly easy, because the old Ottoman script based on Arabic was done away with in the 20s. And there are very few people outside the scholarly establishment that can read it. So you can't say, well, I'll go to the original documents. And I might also say is the original documents, the archives, or the archives as they're called, have been sanitized. For years, people have gone through these things, nominally under the guise of recataloging and arranging, whatever, perhaps. But there's nothing in the archives of Turkey, apparently, so we're told, that substantiates the view that there was an Armenian genocide. Now, if you're going to believe that the archives are flawless and perfect, okay, that's all well and good. The business of trying to come to grips with facts is not easy. And I really feel bad for students now, even as I feel optimistic about the future of people like yourselves. This is an unprecedented period for young people to learn and digest relatively easy compared to my generation, where you had to go to the library and dig things up. A lot of stuff is available online. Books have been scanned, e-books, you name it, immense amounts of information. You can click on Wikipedia. It has its problems too. It has good points and bad points like everything else. You say, well, how do I know the difference? Well, hopefully as time passes, you're a freshman now, you'll come to grips with how to go about doing research that is reliable, or at least surface-wise reliable. Book reviews are frequently useful. Now, through JSTOR, accessible to you through the university databases, is a good place to get some book reviews. There's a book written by someone called Justin McCarthy, who you've heard me mention some time back. He wrote a book in '83 called Muslims and Minorities, the Population of Ottoman Anatolia at the End of the Empire, 1983. Now, he's a so-called demographer, a person who studies population and distribution and location of people. And people say, oh, isn't it great that this demographer has gone into that Ottoman period and looked into it from the perspective of an expert. Some of the book reviews, rather short and by non-specialists, have given him a pretty good assessment. Oh, good book. Then you go across others who you can say have their own axe to grind and say that there's major problems with the work. I won't take time to read them, but they're essentially saying that there's no consistency and that the undercounting of minorities in the Ottoman Empire was something that the Turks wanted to do, and the millats, the heads of the millats, the Armenian millat, the Greek millat, tended to overestimate the populations for political purposes. I say, who am I going to believe? Well, you can read these detailed assessments by the people specializing in these areas. Now, I like movies. You've already figured that out. There's a great line in a movie called The African Queen, put out many years ago, but a major classic. The African Queen, 1951. Katharine Hepburn, the great actress, makes a statement in there to a fellow named Charlie Allnut, who's played by, again, the great actor Humphrey Bogart. And he's been drinking, and she's dumping his liquor into the river, and he gets angry, and it said, it's only human nature. And her answer is, nature is what we were put on earth to rise above. Now that's really a mouthful if you think about it. You say human nature. Teddy Roosevelt apparently said wars will stop when the kids on the street corner stop fighting with one another. And that it's madness to pretend anyone's going to be a pacifist. It just doesn't happen that way. All right, now, incidentally, I want to mention that some of you know Professor Paul Bingham and his wife, Susanna Zachar, on campus here in the Life Sciences building. They've been doing a lot of research, and this business of human nature is something that's kind of interesting. Human evolutionary biology. Some new theories. Human evolution and human history, a complete theory. These are good papers, they're interesting, they're kind of new to the point where people will feel uncomfortable. But when you say nature is what we've been put on earth to rise above, of course it goes back to the biblical period. But the fact is that in theory, we are as a species troublesome, too feisty for our own good. And one can even push it to the extreme and say, look, if you don't like someone, wipe them out. Because it's in the vocabulary. You know that. So we don't have to worry about that. Now, let's get back to this bit of the Turks claiming that there weren't that many Armenians or Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. Well, I take the attitude as follows. If you say there were so few Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, then why were you worried about this so-called fifth column that would rise up and attack Turkey and botch things up? You know, if there are some troublemakers, arrest them and deal with them. There are only a handful. So this kind of contradiction goes through everything. Right now, I've been told by people who run tours to Turkey that there's very little left that harkens back to the period and gives evidence that the Armenians were even there. The Dolmabahce Palace, the big palace in Istanbul that was lived in by some of the sultans, was designed by an Armenian architect family, the Balayans. Remember the IAN surname. Very few, if any, of the guides draw attention to the fact that the Armenians were the ones who designed, maybe one shouldn't be proud of it, it's kind of a Baroque mixture. The Turcophone Armenians. Some of you have heard this word, Turcophone. That means Turkish speaking. You've heard of Francophone East Africa, French speaking Africa. They speak their native dialects, but the lingua franca, as they call it, was and still is, in many cases, French. In Turkey, there were many Armenians who spoke Turkish, even as their first language. And there was an alphabet, the Armenian alphabet was used to pronounce Turkish words. And this was called Armeno-Turkish. And there was a Greco-Turkish too, Greek-speaking, Turkish-speaking Greeks who wrote in Greek. Now, it was a two-way street, though, and the Turks don't want to pay any attention to that at all. Here's a book called Armenian Loanwords in Turkish. Okay? So there's a fair amount, just to show you that it's not a total pancake. There are plenty of words in Turkish that have Armenian origin. I'll bet there aren't too many Turks who want to know that or hear it, because they have been written off. Now, getting back to the architectural aspect, periodically, more recently, Turkey has attempted to reconstruct or rehabilitate some of the pieces of architecture. One in particular, in fact, it's the only one really, the Church of Akdamar on Akdamar Island in Lake Van, which for quite a few years was described as a Turkish building, has been restored. Not a very good job, but it's been restored. They certainly didn't spend that much money doing it and didn't have the best art restoration artists connected with it, but apparently they've stuck a picture of Kemal Ataturk up in the vicinity. Quite exactly what that has to do with anything is another matter. But in the same breath, I will say the following. Barking on, concentrating on the negative aspects of how non-Muslim minorities were treated in the Ottoman Empire doesn't go anywhere other than documenting the facts. Here's a book by a fellow at the Harvard Theological Seminary. I think he's either a graduate. Ringing the Gochnag, Two American Missionary Families in Turkey, 1855 to 1922. Okay, very nice book. carefully done. The point here is that you say, well, what's a gochnag? A gochnag was a wooden board, sort of about yay big, that you would bang on to summon people to church. There was a period where it was illegal to use a bell. Okay? They didn't want to be disturbed by having to hear the chimes of a bell. Now, those days have gone. There's no doubt about that. So it doesn't do any good to say that Christians in that period of the Ottoman Empire were not given civil rights. And that takes me to the next point. Historians say, look, you've got to look at the context. Everyone in Europe was not exactly living the paragon of a democratic life. That's not the way it was. You had an upper crust and then the riffraff. The idea of pretending that the Ottoman Empire should have been more democratic than it was is wishful thinking. They were perhaps a little bit more extreme than one would have liked, but we can't concentrate on things that don't give a picture to things. Now, I want to just point out here, before we go through some slides, the Holocaust in historical context. I just mentioned context. The Armenian Genocide in context. They were afraid, supposedly, that the Armenians were going to be a fifth column, join with the enemy, do us in. The idea of Turkey for the Turks, that was paramount with the Young Turks, hasn't really been emphasized enough. It's absolutely, without doubt, a major dimension of all of this. They wanted the non-Muslim population to be out of the picture. Now, I'm going to read something very simplistic here. Maybe I'll give you a little bit of context. Armenians were widely scattered. Remember I told you the Armenian vilayets where the Armenians had originally been concentrated. They were scattered. Like the Greeks, they tended to be more thrifty than the Turks and to be merchants. They and the Greeks were regarded by the Turks, much as were Jews in prevailingly Christian lands, as clever and tricky, and therefore to be distrusted and disliked. Stirred in part by the hope of European protection. For in the latter part of the 19th century, Great Britain interested itself in the Armenians, and partly in an attempt to checkmate Russia and to exert an influence in Turkey, intermittently claimed a semi-protectorate over them. Some of the Armenians began nationalistic agitation and plots. Thereupon, the Ottoman government, in an endeavor to preserve its authority, connived at and even ordered extensive massacres. These were the Hamidian massacres under Sultan Abdul Hamid II, under whom I talk. These were by Turks and Kurds and wrought great destruction upon the Armenian communities. Okay, now that's one non-Armenian's perspective on what had happened at that point. And if you ask Armenians from that period, what was one of the reasons, and they would say the Armenians were victims of jealousy by the Turks and Kurds. Simple as that. Someone, i.e. the Islamic element, coveted the Armenian nominal wealth. And I say nominal because a lot of them didn't have that much money. But they were frugal. They knew how to make ends meet. And the interesting thing that I learned later on in reading about some of this stuff is that the Armenians had been, quote, persecuted for so long, and had done with many privations over the years, is that they knew how to stretch a buck and to kind of survive when a lot of other groups that were used to plundering to get their daily livelihood, once the fat goose wasn't there to plunder, they kind of had it even worse. And the Armenians, knowing how to survive, did as well as they could. The idea even of eating grass, I've told you about thirst and starvation. Grass was even eaten in some cases. I remember being told by one of my aunts, that is to say the widow of my father's older brother, saying that during the deportation period in one of the camps that I haven't told you anything about, they came across a pregnant donkey, and they ran the poor thing in a circle enough so that she aborted, and they were able to take the aborted donkey and make a meal of it. Now that sounds crude, but it shows you that there was this kind of absolute desperate accommodation to a wretched situation. Now I'm going to just get one point in here because we won't belabor it. You've heard the concentration camps that the Jews and other victims of the Nazi Holocaust were sent to by deportation. The Turkish Empire set up concentration camps in the southern regions for Armenians. They weren't quite as bad as the barbed wire ones, but you were controlled and you were kept in, and you lived in fear that you would be sent off to Derzor to be done. So the concept of concentration camps, some say that we really should look at the way we treated the Indians, the American Indians, our Native Americans, and put them in camps under so-called protection. And in South Africa, during the Boer War, the British kept some of the Boers under control. So the idea of concentration camps is not brand new and certainly doesn't date from the Nazi Holocaust. That's neither here nor there. The paranoia that exists even now amongst the politicians of Turkey, no, we're not saying the average Turk, but I can also say that years ago in Istanbul, I asked someone who was an Armenian in the market, what are things like now? And he told me in Armenian, same old, same old. That was his perception, but that was the general idea. And I'll re-emphasize that it was viewed and still is an art form for an Armenian to survive in Turkey. Now, we've got websites. Some of them are pretty okay. I've given some of them on the handout. Others you can worry about. Malware. I mean, all these signals come up that, you know, you're in the wrong place, you better watch it. And in fact, you do. There are viruses floating around. The business of being so extreme that you're willing to do anything. Here's a paper by that professor I told you at Clark University, Taner Akça. Review article. He's written many. This is just one I want to read. Anatomy of a Crime. The Turkish Historical Society's manipulation of archival documents. Now that gives you great inspiration for being able to go into the archives and get the last word, doesn't it? Okay? This is, they'll doctor anything they need to. Now, there's also argument over words. Deutschland und die Ausrottung der Armenier in der Türkei. Germany and the extermination of the Armenians in Turkey. This happens to have been written in 1930 by an Armenian. People have used the tactic of saying that the word annihilation in that period, or extermination, really didn't mean then what it might do now. And that it's propaganda. Now this gives me an excuse to harp for 1 minute on the word propaganda. If you go to Rome in the vicinity of the Spanish Steps. There's a building, and it says the Propaganda de Fidei, the Collegio, the College of the Propaganda of the Faith. Well, the propaganda of the faith meant in that period teaching. And you might have noticed, some of you might be Roman Catholic, that the altering of that word to the faith being propitiated, moved forward, is different from propaganda. So propaganda in the beginning meant teaching. It was a good word. And now they've switched it to doctrine, okay, propagation of the doctrine of the faith. A little bit different from calling it propaganda, because they're afraid that people will say propaganda sounds like it's not true, because that's the connotation now. Propaganda is not anything to admire. And I'll also throw in that propaganda was indeed a way of getting the word out to your public so that you would see the enemy as someone that you should join the army for and fight against and put in your money into the kitty, do everything possible to put yourself on our side versus them. They're bad, we're good, and we've come to full circle on that with our exceptionalism. We're better than anyone, and that, well, I hope, I wish, we know better. Now, I held this thing up, Holocaust in historical context. Now, Stephen T. Katz, I'm not even sure if he's alive now. He might be dead. He was at Boston University, amongst other places. And he says something that I want to read, if I can find the spot, that the exceptionalism idea doesn't apply only to people, not just us, for instance. But the uniqueness of the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, that's an expression that has been used again and again and again and again. Uniqueness. And then people say, look, is it unique? Well, everything's unique, has been the counter-argument. There's no doubt that the Germans, the Nazis, were very advanced people. The technology, the machinations, the mechanization of extermination, very advanced, very different from the direct massacres of the Armenians and others in Eastern Asia Minor, and the subsidiary technique of deporting people into very hostile areas so that you would die of thirst and starvation and deprivation and a few more massacres. That's very different from being gassed and burned. Perhaps the end result is you're dead. So the idea of being unique and therefore everyone else is subsidiary. Now, I've got a statement here I want to read. I think it's very well said, and that's why I'm reading it. There's a discussion that was given in a section, you don't know where the book comes from, against a culture of competing catastrophes. Now, how do you like that? Against a culture of competing catastrophes. Oh, we suffered more than you did. It was terrible, terrible, and yours was only terrible. And they were terrible, 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 and you go on and on and on and on. And again, you can relate to this in terms of how are you going to relate to a crime against humanity? Are we going to compete with one another? And this guy here says, there can be no doubt as to the catastrophic fate that befell the Armenians of Turkey between 1915 and 1917. Well, if you're asking an Armenian, they went till 1923 and beyond, and maybe even as late as now. Yet in no way denying the Armenian tragedy. You see, the tragedy, these words are much softened. My understanding of its causation, now that's a qualification, his understanding, well, it's inadequate in my opinion, and I keep on saying my opinion because it is my opinion, of its causation, unfolding, and consequences, not reading of this event. This is in no way be understood as supporting the fraudulent, deceitful efforts of Turkish apologists to deny the Armenian tragedy. My reservations are solely methodological and phenomenological. They have only to do with how to categorize this criminal event, whether as genocide per se or not. Now, my argument is that he hasn't read the Genocide Convention. And if you want to read the Genocide Convention, you go into that reference that we gave you and click on the URLs, and you'll see the actual digitized copies of the pages of the conventions. So here he is pontificating. He just one example. And yet we told you about the banality of evil and denial of plenty of Jews. The state of Israel is different from the Jews, just like our own government is different from the American people. A book was written years ago, one of our great journalists, All Governments Lie. It's true, our own government lies all the time. The Turkish government lies too, I can guarantee you. You say, well, that's their job to lie. Well, I don't know, maybe. Now here's something amusing. It's sick. There's an article here on the Kurds by an expert in the area, and the fun part is this. The American Library in Ankara faced a similar problem. Let me start up. In the past 12 months, the British Embassy in Ankara, which is the old city of Angora, you know where the Angora cats come from, the modern capital of modern Turkey. In the past 12 months, the British Embassy in Ankara has had to intervene to protect the British Institute of Archaeology. This was written in 1984, which 10 years earlier had published a guidebook to Ankara whose maps of Hellenistic, that is to say Greek, and Roman Asia Minor showed a region called Armenia, quote, end quote. The American Library of Ankara faced a similar problem when a reader complained about unwelcome geographical expressions in two of its atlases. The U.S. ambassador recommended that the books should be withdrawn immediately. Now, that's a very brave thing, isn't it? Withdraw the books. Yeah, it's succumbing to pressure. His officials resisted. Well, at least someone had gumption. A decision by Washington eventually ruled that the Reader's Digest Atlas and the National Geographic Atlas could remain on the shelves. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the deputy manager of Lufthansa, the German airline, briefly stood trial for possession of an ancient globe on which Armenia, Pontus, remember that Greek area I told you that borders the Black Sea, and Kurdistan were marked. Travelers, too, had censorship problems. 5 Britons traveling in eastern Turkey were held for 5 days in Adıyaman and Sivas after a farmer had denounced them for photographing old buildings where massacres of Armenians, absolutely unbeknown to them, had once taken place. A fellow of Oxford College was startled in Tunceli when police and gendarmes with floodlights staged a raid on his hotel bedroom. He'd been looking at too many medieval castles. A visiting fellow of another Oxford college was detained for several hours in Ankara for making notes into a pocket cassette recorder while looking at the citadel. These examples, shocking or hilarious as you will, could be multiplied. Now here's the one I really like. there was the Foreign and Common Office Secretary called Jillian, for instance, who had some difficulty getting into Turkey because police thought she might be an Armenian. Jillian, you may know, is a not uncommon woman's first name in England. So Jillian, because of her Yan ending, I-A-N, was taken by some ignoramus. Now, the thing is that these are clearly extreme. It's a long time ago. You say, well, things are better now. Maybe a tiny bit, but not really. But it wasn't too many bits and pieces ago that an Armenian, a Turk of Armenian extraction and parentage was murdered. He was actually a very gentle, able person, Hrant Dink. Many Armenians, or most Armenians in Turkey, have long since dropped their yan ending. They've taken on the oğlu, which is the Turkish ending for son of, so-and-so oğlu. The Greeks had taken that on too as well. Yet another strategy for seeking impunity is not only to deny all of this and to do everything possible to make it clear that there are two sides to every story, but the other thing is to act as a watchdog to prevent things from happening that you don't want to happen. Now, this here is a issue of the intelligence report published by the Southern Poverty Law Center. State of denial, Turkey entices U.S. scholars, lawmakers to cover up Armenian genocide. This issue, put out 2008, got into a lot of trouble because an organization that was hired by a Turkish group brought a suit against the author of that article, saying that it was all based on falsehood and that there was slander, etc., involved in it. They won the lawsuit. I don't know how they settled it. I don't think the details were made available on that. But the bottom line is that there's a gang of people out there keeping track of what's said so that they can intervene at appropriate points. I'm sure the Turkish government must spend a fair amount of money in addition to hiring lobbyists in Washington from our own retired politicians to put a good face on all of this. Now, the dynamics of destruction, culture and mass killing in the First World War, Turkey and the Armenian Genocide, there are so many of these things. I've just elected to bring in a few just to, again, show you that I'm not pulling this stuff out of my hat. It can all be argued, but I think the bottom line is that in contrast to the term, the opinion voiced by this fellow who sort of, it wasn't a genocide, there's yet another one, the Holocaust. Okay, edited work, Robert Hauptmann, Susan Hubbs-Mouton. Statement by one of the authors, all too unhappily, the Holocaust as it recedes into the past. And I'll comment here, a German friend of mine, a retired professor, said that most of the students in Bonn, where he was located, hadn't a clue about what the Nazi Germans had done. So it's not just the Armenian genocide that's fading away, as that picture showed, and is pixelating. It recedes into the past, stands out less as an aberration than as prelude. To be historically accurate, one should ascribe that, quote unquote, honor to the Armenian genocide as the one ushering in the 20th century. And I will say that it wasn't really the first, because what the Germans did to the Herero in Namibia qualifies as a genocide as well, although some people have argued that point. Now I'm going to take some time now to fly through some slides that will give a face to some of this Because the one thing that we're all weak on here in courses like this is that we don't put a face on things, and it's considered kind of not really chic to show pictures. When you see the human face on all of these atrocities and genocides, it's enough to curl your hair. And others have said that if the public saw these things happening, they'd put an end to war straight away. Lord Kitchener said, I don't know why everyone's getting all upset about these atrocities. He said, war is an atrocity. War is a breakdown of human morality. Now, if you look at it that way, you'll probably think about being a pacifist. Now, this scheme shows the interrelatedness of things. Everything harkens back, interrelates. It's very complicated, but you see, I've also had this drawn in a way where there's certain parts that are absolutely inviolable. It's true. Maybe in my course of talking I didn't emphasize enough. I should have made perfectly clear here and there and wherever, this, that, or the other. I might have even thrown in a few dates that weren't absolutely positive. I'd be off a tiny bit, but that doesn't mean the broad picture doesn't hold. I've elected to give these lectures impromptu rather than have my script so it would all be perfect and you'd all be sleeping. Next, please. Now, I've even said that if I want to emphasize Anatolia, this is a German map, Anadoli. This part here was Anatolia. Well, modern Turkey has now called all of this Anatolia. Kleinasien was the German word. Small Asia, Asia Minor. Okay. One of the things that one does in a university is to do revision. Remember, I told you a little while ago about what a university is. Revision is usually you revise something and correct errors, refine it, give it a nuance. That's the pure definition of revisionism. But there's also a kind of revisionism is that you recast the whole thing and claim that everything that went before was wrong and this is the real story. So even at the level of maps can be highly political. The next slide. And since the argument is made that these maps can vary. Now, I told you, the particularly troublesome and troubled part of the world that contains the shifting frontier of Occidentalism. I told you about these decisions that had been made early and at the end of the war. The Treaty of Sèvres, where there was supposed to be an Armenia of some substance that was set up, and a Kurdistan, etc. Turkey was going to be shrunk quite a lot. Well, the idea was that Kemal Ataturk rose up, rallied round his people, and they drove everyone out and all of that, and no one was ready to put the peace treaty terms into action by backing it up militarily. And the intended borders, etc., shifted once again. The next slide. Next slide, please. Now, I'll be criticized for not having used Turkish sources, because that's the standard complaint out of those who put forward the Turkish point of view. This is a Turkish map. It's talking about, this would have been what Turkey amounted to had the Treaty of Sèvres taken hold and not been superseded by the Treaty of Lausanne. The Turkish point of view, this was going to be the Italian area, this is going to be the French, this was going to be the English, the Arabia, Arabistan, Misr, Egypt. Next slide. Well, the Turks did show all of these people. I've also pointed out here that this active program of denial, obfuscation, what have you. Next slide, that's my interpretation. That's a wonderful cartoon. Now, 1909, the massacres in Cilicia Adana being the main focal point. Why European governments have viewed Muslim barbarity without protest, and why America may speak for Christendom. Well, the idea was that we were more pure and with less motive than anybody else, and that was true then. You certainly couldn't say that now. The Europeans were seen as wanting to have their clutches on the Ottoman Empire. Next. The imagery from that period is very emotional. They tore the babes from the arms of their mothers to hack them to pieces with knives or throw them alive into the fire. Not good artwork, but that certainly doesn't foster any desire to be forgiving and to see that there were two sides to every story. The next slide. Now there are cartoons that even way back when in 2007, we don't have time to refute charges of genocide. Right now, we've got to wipe out the Kurds. Well, the Kurds have always been a problem for Turkey. They still are. They're very anxious that the Kurds in the northern part of Iraq not filter over either emotionally, intellectually, or physically into Turkey. Next slide. Yet another. This is a joke, 2003, reserves called up for deployment to Turkey. Turkey is seen as an American ally, our trusted ally, especially in that communist era. It was seen as being a critical border area. The Russians were a great menace. Our only hope was that Turkey let us have access to airfields, which we built and paid for and still pay for, incidentally. And we send money periodically. We give them arms, blah, blah. Okay, so the strong ally that's always been described, but some perspectives, my opinion, is that they look after their own interests. You say, well, that's what governments are all about. Next slide. Modern hatreds. There are plenty of modern hatreds, and people have recognized that a lot of these modern hatreds, whether they're real hatreds or quasi-hatreds, is arguable. But a lot of things that go on, and when the lights come on later, I'm going to show you an illustration here. The difficulties in various hotspots throughout the world can go right back to that period. Right now, we talked a little bit about the diasporas, the Armenian diaspora in America. Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was yet another diaspora. The Armenians that could and wanted to left the Soviet Union, Soviet Armenia, and went out to LA for the most part. Now, with all of the terrible difficulties happening in the area of Syria, there's now what they're calling, or have called for some time, diasporas within diasporas. Those who had survived in Lebanon and in Syria after the genocide and made homes in Lebanon and Syria have yet again moved out, and there's a lot of Armenians seeking to get out of Syria if they can. There's fundraisers for Armenians of Syrian or Syrians of Armenian background seeking to get out. The next slide. One strategy that's been used by the Turks is that what's called in law, et tu kukwe, you did it too. Pots calling kettles black. Or reissuing constantly images of the horrible atrocities done by the Armenians. Armenia is the Armenian terrorism. And the same thing for Greeks. The next slide we'll see. Now, the emptying of Asia Minor after the burning of Smyrna by the Turks, who they claim the Greeks burned the city and the Armenians burned the city. Those who were there saw who burned it, but it's a lot easier to kind of say, well, why would the Turks burn their own city? Well, there's been good articles written on that too. The United States, again, did some good things, part of our outreach program. Next slide. There's American. The atrocities of the Greeks, now 1923, when you're trying to make the case that, oh, they've been terrible to us. Oh, it's oh, you know, you're saying the wrong thing. You're trying to stereotype us. Some people have said, look, it is true. There were some atrocities. The scorched earth policy that the Greeks put in place as they, emptied Asia Minor. But if you look at this book, which is very rare, the evidence is so superficial, it's to be funny. And the apologists for the Greeks doing these atrocities say, look, who started it? And since there's been a lot on Amy Goodman recently about Martin Luther King, we take one of his quotations and say that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, pretty soon everybody ends up being blind. So that it doesn't go anywhere to say, well, you did it. Well, you did it first, we're just getting even. It's a cyclical type of thing. Next, please. The other approach, the blue book about which we said, it's all baloney, it's propaganda. It's not true. Now, if you read The Treatment of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, History of the Blue Book by David Miller. David Miller worked at the embassy in Armenia, and you said, well, he's biased. That means no one can write anything about anything because you're biased, and who wants to write something about which they have no interest in? The Blue Book was put out by an organization, next please, that was engaged in propaganda, but it hadn't been put into propaganda till later than this was done. The maps and so forth in that volume, they're excellent. We told you about the next slide that will show you that the key to names of persons and places withheld. Remember I said they didn't want to have the names in the Blue Book? Well, it was published. It comes from our National Archives, confidential. Well, no, well, they all made it up. Propaganda. Next slide. One of the approaches was to say that Lord Bryce, who pushed this and was worked on by Arnold Toynbee, who was a young Oxford scholar at that time, who became a great historian. The business of Bryce talking about the Belgian atrocities. So he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's wrong. Well, over the years, as a result of digging up information and looking into the archives and diaries of German soldiers, they've found out that, yeah, there were quite a few German atrocities, maybe not the ones that were centered on chopping off the hands of little kids, but there were atrocities. James Bryce was a man of high integrity, and he too was probably turning in his grave for having been accused of being a liar, only by those who would have the story different from what he said it was. Next slide, please. Now, the other approach has been to say that, well, Toynbee took it all back. He took it all back. He didn't mean that the Armenians were the victims of genocide. Well, that's rubbish. This comes from Mankind and Mother Earth, A Narrative History of the World by Arnold Toynbee, 1970, Oxford University Press. Now, page 585, the Biosphere. The atrociousness of the two great 20th century wars was aggravated by genocide, i.e. the wholesale extermination of civilian populations. In the First World War, the Turks committed genocide against the Armenians. In the Second World War, the Germans committed genocide against the Jews. Now, how much more positive can you be? And to say that Toynbee never really, he was sorry that he ever said it was a genocide, didn't really mean it, blah, blah, blah. All you need is a little bit of knowledge. Next slide. Now, the pictures have also been important. Those of you interested in photography. underexposed. Pictures can lie and liars can use pictures. Very interesting book. Next slide. I won't read the small print, probably can't read it, but this is a picture from the period of the genocide where no one's even sure who she is. Some have said it's a mother with her 2 young kids, some there's an older sister with 2. But they made the error of saying that these 3 people were victims of genocide by the Turks. The Turks in London, through the aegis of their ambassador, said, look, this is not true, you better pull the picture, and they actually got, next slide, the government, not the government, they got the outfit, Corbis, to pull the picture. Now, they didn't have the copyright on the pictures, and that was to their advantage because they could use the excuse that we do not have the rights to this, and therefore the best thing for us to do is to withdraw it. And I say, if they had copyright, if in fact they did, which they didn't, then would they have so quickly drawn it? No, because this is the kind of thing. Intimidation is one of the techniques. Next slide. Now, 10 cents a day will save a life. That's in 1917. Pretty cheap. Talk about life is cheap. Charles R. Crane, treasurer of the American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief, New York City. Next slide. Millions of human beings are starving. Asia Minor, Sivas, Armenia, Kharput, Kurdistan, Mesopotamia, between the 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Next slide. Near East relief has saved 1 million. This was 1922, the report to Congress. Remember I told you the Near East relief was incorporated in the laws of the United States. Report to Congress says operations have an amounted total of $70 million. Now, on the basis of inflation, that amounts to an enormous amount of money. And one of the stances used by the Turkish point of view is to say that, well, the calculation of that with inflation is not justified. Next slide. Now, I mentioned also, I think, that Kemal Ataturk, the hero of the Gallipoli, Gelibolu campaign, where the Europeans, the Anzac troops, etc., were driven out, the Nutuk really translate the Nutuk, the speech. It went on for 6 days, 6 hours a day, and this marathon essentially, this is volume 1. This volume, next slide. It's been reprinted a zillion times. Next slide. It's a rewriting of the history of the country. Remember I said they changed the Sultanate was done away with, no more sultans. Secularization. Turkey in the world. The empire, the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey has Kemal Ataturk saying that we're going to use Western script. We're going to the Roman alphabet, Latin letters, it's a lot easier. Change it a little bit. Next slide. We've got all kinds of encyclopedias. This, of course, refers to the Cambodian genocide, which some people say it's a fratricide or auto-genocide, a self-genocide, killing your brothers. These things enter into the literature. There's updated versions of this. There are online. The Armenian genocide is always in these. Now, why would people enter non-genocides into this? Are they thinking that the Armenians are so influential as to be able to create history from scratch? That's one of the arguments, apparently. If you say it didn't happen, how come it ends up here? Are we going to ignore everything? Next slide. The Widening Circle of Genocide, critical bibliographic review done a long time ago. Take a look at the next one. You'll see the compelling confirmations of the Armenian Genocide in German and Austrian sources. They say, well, if we go into the sources that are not Armenian, then maybe we can find some information. If we can't find it in the Turkish archives, documentation, the importance of the documents. In other words, if you find it in the archives of those who were on Turkey's side, or Turkey was on their side, it takes on more meaning. I think that that's fine, it's good, it's defensible, but I also think that the Armenian sources, which for the most part have been not ignored, but haven't been taken full advantage of, will have to be dealt with one day soon. Next. Now, we mentioned Talat Pasha. Talat Slayer acquitted in Berlin court. Armenian boy who laid murder to vision of mother in dream is freed on insanity plea. Now, I don't have time to build on this too much, but when the war was over and the Young Turk leadership had kind of flown the coop, Talat was in Berlin, others were in Rome. One of the political parties in exile decided that they would put in place an operation called Nemesis. Now, some of you may know enough Greek, excuse me, mythology to know that Nemesis was one of the goddesses of revenge. And the idea was that since we're not getting justice through the court and the court hearings, we'll take it in our hands to do in these people. And a young student was engaged to murder Talat Pasha, and he successfully did it. And there was a murder trial, and he was acquitted. Now, I should mention that Raphael Lemkin knew about this trial, and he thought that it was a pity that the law was not put in place properly and that there was no law or legal basis to bring these people to justice through the legal system. And it was taken into the hands of assassins or murderers. That's what started him off in his career of thinking about genocide. This was the case. Next slide. Why Talat's assassin was acquitted. There are some of these telegrams up here. Those telegrams have been worked over to death by the Turkish point of view adherents who say that these were forgeries. Okay, so you see everywhere along the line, evidence is discredited and dismissed. Next slide. There's Talat Pasha on the left and Solomon Terlirian, who was buried in Fresno and whose body was exhumed and is now buried in Armenia. Next slide. He's viewed as a hero by some. These telegrams, the cipher telegrams, were written and argued, and they'll probably be argued to the kingdom come. Next slide. In Germany, periodically, the trial is actually put on the radio or performed otherwise, just to show you that these things are not dead. The next slide. There he is. They've even got the street in Charlottenburg where he was done in. Next slide. Now, let's hop along. Jump way ahead. We told you about Leslie Davis, the last American consul in Harput in Eastern Asia Minor. Susan Blair, a Long Islander, was working in the National Archives. We don't have to worry about the context, but she came across this long-lost report written by Leslie Davis in 1919 and ended up editing it and putting it out, and lo and behold, that book caused her all kinds of difficulties. When the book was published, she was personally threatened. The firm that published it, a Greek press in New Rochelle, New York, was threatened. And she ended up going underground and has led a very different lifestyle from what she might have preferred to do. But she feared for her life with good reason. Next slide. Haunted by an old horror, a family's ordeal, shedding light on a 1959 genocide has forced a Virginia writer into the shadows. Next slide. Now, one of the things that the Armenians have done that I don't particularly appreciate is that they have always tried to draw an analogy between what happened to the Jews. They've diminished what happened to the others, but as we've said, if you're going to be fully cognizant of what happened, the mosaic of victims is substantial. Hitler and the Armenian Genocide. He made a speech in 1939 before the invasion of Poland, where he said, "Who remembers the extermination of the Armenians?" Some have said, well, that the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, would not have happened if, in fact, the proper punishment had been meted out to the perpetrators of genocide in World War I. Well, you know, the approach has been that particular statement has been questionable. It wasn't entered into the Nuremberg trials, and on and on and on and on. And I, in fact, sent some of the original German research to Professor Schmidt for him to read. He hadn't read the original analyses. And the bottom line is, yeah, it did. And there's a movement periodically, now and again, to have the statement expunged from the walls of the U.S. National Holocaust Museum and Memorial in Washington, because it's not true. They don't want to be put in the same category of Hitler. Next slide. I think that's the last one, isn't it? Yeah, good. Now we can have some lights. So I've covered a lot. I've tried to tell you that you can be immune, you can be rid of any accusation if you raise sufficient question about the veracity of the genocide. And the final note I want to end on is that some of these people who profess to be genocide specialists say, look, the last stage in most genocides is that you have denial. You have denial. This is about dishonesty among scientists. You see, on occasion, the tremendous scandal surfaces that some laboratory data was forged, fabricated. It can't be duplicated, because that's one of the all-important things about science, that someone should be able to do what you did and confirm what you did. And if you fib about it, that's not good. Now, I'll just leave out certain things. As Thomas Sazaz, who is a Jewish philosopher, an American, pointed out long ago, the label of mental illness or emotional disturbance is more and more frequently applied to explain behavior that is not normative. The reliance on such a label to explain behavior represents an abnegation of moral responsibility. See, it says, oh, they know not what they do. They didn't mean it. You did it too. You do it too. It was a terrible tragedy. We lost all these people, and as I said during one of my talks, that, yeah, you lost most of your people through war. Not all. There were a lot of Turkish civilians too, but they were in a situation where you go into details, and this mentality of that we don't want to have anything to do with the Armenians. You remember there was an earthquake in Turkey, and Armenia that had its own earthquake was going to send blood. They didn't want Armenian blood to sully the blood in their Turkish veins. Absolute rubbish. If the biochemists got in there, they'd show that they're all mongrels, every last one of everybody everywhere. In fact, it's our only hope is to become mongrelized so that you can get rid of what was called years ago by an editorial in Newsday on Long Island, that we've got to get rid of this tribalism, and once we get rid of tribalism, we can start becoming civilized human beings. Anyways, you've got a lot more of this course to go. I've covered what I could. I tried to cover everything in at least a rough, superficial way, and I say good luck.